meaning to, just because it felt good to be there. Think of the European cafe, the village market, the town square in a small Italian city where people just show up on a Sunday evening because everyone else shows up on a Sunday evening. In post-war suburban America, a landscape deliberately built around cars and cul-de-sacs with almost no at the time, because it meant the mall wasn't just a retail destination, it was where community happened, where strangers became familiar faces over months and years, where the small, quiet, everyday connections that hold a neighborhood together were formed, not through any organized effort or civic program, but simply because people kept showing up in the same place, week after week, year after year. That kind of social infrastructure is easy to take for granted when it exists, and almost impossible to replace once it's gone. Now here's the part most people get completely wrong. The story most people know goes like this. Amazon arrived. People started ordering online. Malls became obsolete. Clean, simple, obvious. But here's the problem. When Amazon was still just an online bookstore in the mid-1990s, when most Americans had never bought a single thing from a website, malls across the country were already losing customers. Vacancy rates were already climbing. Anchor stores were already struggling. E-commerce didn't create the disease. It accelerated a disease that already existed. So what was the disease? After World War II, America went on one of the biggest building sprees in its history. Every time a new suburb appeared, and they were appearing constantly, developers built a mall, then another one in the next town, then another 20 minutes down the highway. The numbers tell the story clearly. Between 1970 and 2015, retail space per person in the US grew far faster than the population itself. At the peak, Americans had around 23 to 24 square feet of retail space each, many times more than the UK, Germany, or France. What that means in plain terms, America didn't have a shortage of shoppers. It had way too many malls chasing the same shoppers. Imagine a town with a steady population. In 1975, it has one mall, and it thrives. By 1995, the same town, same residents, same incomes, now has 3 malls fighting for the exact same dollars. Someone is going to lose. The industry had built far more than the market could support. During the economic boom of the 80s and 90s, that was easy to ignore, but the fragility was always there underneath. And then one specific thing pushed it over the edge. A chain reaction built directly into the structure of the mall itself that turned a slow decline into something almost impossible to stop. Almost nobody saw it coming. Here's a question with a surprisingly simple answer. How can one store closing bring down an entire mall? A mall can have 100 stores. If one leaves, 99 remain. So why does one departure start pulling the whole thing apart? It comes down to something called an anchor store. Sears, Macy's, JCPenney, Montgomery Ward. These weren't just large retailers sitting at the ends of corridors. Their real job, more important than anything they actually sold, was pulling people into the building. Here's how it worked. You need a refrigerator. You drive to the mall because Sears is there. You park, walk in, spend time in the appliance section. But to get there, and to get back to your car, you walk through hundreds of feet of corridor, a shoe store, a greeting card shop, a jewelry boutique, a candle store. You weren't planning to buy shoes, but there they are, right in your path. Sometimes you stop, and when you stop, the mall makes money. That unplanned spending was the economic lifeblood of every smaller store in the building. It's the only reason their business models worked. Mall architects understood this so well that they deliberately placed anchors at opposite ends of the building, specifically to make customers walk the full length of the corridor between them. The route from Sears to Macy's wasn't accidental. It was engineered, and when that anchor disappeared, everything built around it started to fall. That's where a legal concept most people have never heard of comes in. It's called the co-tenancy clause. When smaller retailers signed their mall leases, Many of them negotiated a specific protective condition into their contracts. If one or more of the named anchor stores left the mall, the smaller tenant had the right to reduce their rent, sometimes significantly, or to walk away from the lease entirely before their term was up. The logic behind this was completely straightforward. These stores knew, and their lawyers knew, that their customer traffic was directly tied to the anchors. People weren't driving to the mall to visit a mid-sized greeting card shop. They were driving for Sears. The smaller stores were capturing a share of that traffic as it moved through the building. No anchor meant no traffic. No traffic meant the rent they'd agreed to pay no longer reflected the commercial reality they were operating in. So when Sears announced it was closing a location, which it did hundreds of times through the 2000s and 2010s as the company's finances deteriorated, it wasn't just one store disappearing from the directory near the entrance. It was a legal and economic signal to every other tenant in that building that the ground beneath them had shifted. Some triggered their co-tenancy clauses immediately. Others quietly chose not to renew when their terms came up, rather than locking in for another several years in an increasingly uncertain environment. Foot traffic dropped. Revenue for the remaining stores fell. Some of those stores closed. Fewer customers meant even less reason for the next tenant to stay. More stores closed. Each step down made the next one more likely. A retail analyst once described it this way: a shopping mall is not a collection of independent businesses that happen to share a building. It is an interconnected ecosystem. Remove the keystone species, and the rest begins to destabilize in ways that are very hard to reverse. That is exactly what played out across hundreds of malls in America through the 2000s and 2010s. Not with drama, not with front-page headlines, just store by store, corridor by corridor, food court stall by food court stall, until the whole structure became impossible to sustain. And here's what makes the full picture even more complicated. Even if no anchor store had ever closed, even if that entire chain reaction had somehow never been set off, there was still a deeper shift happening underneath all of it. A shift in human behavior, in priorities, in what people actually wanted to do with their time, that would have caught up with malls eventually regardless. Because the problem wasn't just where Americans were shopping, it was whether they wanted to show up at all. Here's a fact that gets overlooked in almost every conversation about mall decline. American consumer spending did not collapse when malls started struggling. Total retail sales kept climbing through the 2000s and well into the 2010s. The money didn't disappear. Americans were spending more than ever. They just weren't spending it in malls. The money was moving toward experiences, travel, concerts and live events, dining out at restaurants that felt worth the trip, fitness memberships, streaming subscriptions, weekend getaways, things that left behind a memory and a story rather than another item to find space for at home. This wasn't a random or unpredictable cultural shift. It was a documented behavioral change that economists and sociologists had been tracking for years. Younger consumers especially were beginning to place higher value on what they did over what they owned. And the mall, built almost entirely around acquiring and owning things, had no real answer for that shift. Think about how a typical middle-class family might have spent a Saturday in 1988 compared to today. In 1988, the mall was the plan. You drove there as a family, had lunch together in the food court, picked up a few things you needed, maybe caught a movie at the multiplex inside. The mall was the container that held the entire day. It gave the day shape and structure without anyone having to think too hard about it. Today, that same family might spend Saturday morning at a local farmer's market, try a new restaurant across town for lunch, and watch something together on a streaming platform that evening. The mall never enters the picture, not because of any strong feeling against malls specifically, but simply because it isn't offering something that can't be found somewhere else in a form they'd enjoy more. And then a generation came along that had never really thought of the mall as their default social space to begin with. For Generation Z, the third place isn't a physical location. It's a group chat, a live stream, a comment section, a shared playlist, spaces where they spend time with people they know, develop their sense of who they are, stay connected to their social world, and none of it requires leaving the house, finding a ride, or spending money to justify being there. This doesn't mean young people don't want real, in-person connection. They do. Studies consistently show that younger generations report high levels of loneliness and actively want more face-to-face time with people they care about. But the specific kind of casual, low-stakes, unscheduled social experience that malls once made possible, just showing up and seeing who else showed up, has migrated almost entirely to digital spaces. And the mall, which was never really selling products so much as it was selling a certain kind of effortless togetherness, lost its most important competitive advantage the moment that togetherness became accessible without a 20-minute drive and a parking spot. If this video has helped you see the mall story in a new way, a like genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people. Takes 2 seconds and it makes a real difference. So what actually happens to the buildings once the stores are gone and the anchors have left? This is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody saw coming, and it's one of the more genuinely interesting parts of all of this. In Columbus, Ohio, a regional mall lost its anchor tenant when a major department store chain closed the location following bankruptcy restructuring. That vacant space, a cavernous 85,000 square foot shell, sitting at the end of a half-empty corridor, sat unused for months while developers tried to figure out what to do with it. Then a large non-denominational church made an offer. Today, that former department store is a full church campus. Sunday services draw thousands of people into the building every single week, but the effect ripples outward beyond the services themselves. After services end, families move into the food court for lunch. They walk the corridors. They stop into the stores that are still open. They treat the mall as a destination again, not because of what it sells, but because of what it hosts. A church, with literally nothing to sell in any retail sense, became one of the most effective foot traffic generators in the entire building. It was doing through community and belonging exactly what Sears once did through refrigerators and washing machines. And this isn't a one-off example. Bowling alleys and indoor climbing gyms have moved into former clothing chains across the country. Medical clinics and urgent care centers now occupy spaces that used to be shoe stores, bringing in repeat visitors on a regular basis. College programs and vocational training centers have taken over entire wings of malls that would otherwise sit dark. Apartment developers have converted former anchor store buildings into residential units, bringing residents directly into the mall's footprint. Then there's something perhaps even more unexpected. Barnes & Noble, the bookstore that plenty of people had already written off as a relic, a business that couldn't possibly survive in the age of one-day shipping and ebooks, has quietly become one of the most sought-after tenants in American retail real estate. In several malls where it currently operates, its foot traffic actually outperforms the remaining department stores. People spend an hour or two there without intending to. They bring their kids and let them wander the shelves. They sit in the cafe section and stay longer than they planned. They treat it less like a store and more like somewhere genuinely worth going. One developer put the new logic simply: the successful mall today doesn't try to compete with Amazon on price or on convenience. That battle was lost a long time ago. Instead, it competes with the couch. If it gives people a genuine reason to get up and actually go somewhere, not a discount, not a sale, but a real human reason, then foot traffic follows. And where foot traffic goes, everything else eventually follows too. That shift in thinking, from maximizing transactions to maximizing the time people want to spend in the building, is now the organizing principle behind every mall that is actually managing, not just to survive, but to find a new identity. Which brings us back to the question that has been quietly sitting underneath this entire story. What is actually being lost here? Not the stores, not the anchor tenants, not the slightly dated late 20th century architecture with its food court skylights and indoor fountains. What's being lost is something harder to put into words. You tend to feel it most clearly when you try to describe it to someone who didn't grow up with it, and realize how strange it sounds to explain that you used to just go somewhere for no reason and feel good about it. The mall at its height was a place where you could show up without an agenda. No reservation, no ticket, no plan required. You just appeared, and suddenly you were in the middle of other people who had also just appeared, for their own reasons or no reason at all. You might run into someone you hadn't spoken to in years. You might end up in a 20-minute conversation with a complete stranger at the food court simply because you were both there and nothing was stopping you. You might sit down on a bench, watch the flow of life moving past, and feel, without needing to name it, that you were part of something larger than your own household. Sociologists have studied this kind of space carefully for decades. The concept was developed and named by researcher Ray Oldenburg, who argued that third places aren't just nice to have, they're structurally necessary to healthy community life. They're where social capital gets built, where the low-level everyday trust